honestly didn't get the hype behind Bridget cosplays until I threw together this closet cosplay. And like, this is paper and felt, and I'm already like, ooh, so cute. I love it. Hi, Bridget trans. I don't know why this is still a debate in some circles, but just looking up the words Bridget trans does lead you to some transphobic ranting about the devs lying. So I wanted to make a video that hopefully compiles some of the more basic talking points and just makes it easy to be like, no. A lot of the arguments against Bridget being trans are founded solely within the text, disregarding any meta context, and you honestly can't do that. It's a pointless maneuver that is intended just to trap the people arguing for her being trans within the fictitious cage written up by someone who's not even part of the argument. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the author intended when they step into a space that isn't theirs. So even if Daisuke Ishiwatari did happen to write Bridget to be cis, an author representing a group doesn't have the right to have their work overshadow the way people in that group actually live. We are not toys for your narratives. Our representation is not your tool, and you don't get to use it that way and get to keep the character as is without audience reinterpretation. With any form of art, the intent of the creator is not more important than the audience's interpretation. Once a piece is released to the public, the perception of that piece fully belongs to the public. An artist can share their intent, but it will not overwrite the perception brought by the numerous surveyors with different backgrounds and experiences. It just can't, especially because the artist's statement of intent itself will be reinterpreted by that audience. It's not a pure exchange of information from one person's brain to another. It's a game of telephone just like everything else is in life. This character is not a real person. They are not here to side with the author or the public. They don't exist to explore their own gender and give us a deeper understanding of their journey. They also don't hear you claiming what gender they are or are not. They don't get hurt if you claim that they are or are not trans representation. But do you know who does get hurt? Trans people. Think about it. If you really are vehemently against this character being trans, why? Why does it matter to you if some people find representation in a character that you don't feel accurately reflects them? Why do you have a problem with a community seeing a character that, at the very least, is undeniably similar to them, and then taking issue with how that character is treated in the narrative? I find it hard to believe that there's a good faith argument in that. I certainly believe that it's possible to make a bad faith argument under the presumption that you're making a good faith argument. I know that I spent many years of my life doing the same, mocking trans people without realizing that I was actually shielding myself from a truth I wasn't ready to handle. But that doesn't make up for it. The action is still harmful, even if the intent is not. Ultimately, if an author decides to take a community they know little about and use them as a tool to stumble through some ill-informed representation, it's the community's right to do what they wish with that character, whether that be adopting the character and criticizing the author, or rejecting both outright. Inconsistencies between real life and fictional representation do not need to be ignored. Authors are humans, not gods. Their mistakes are condemnable, and their actions have consequences, especially for the communities that they represent, whether that representation is intentional or not. Just a reminder, canon does not equal fact. What is real within an author's fictional world is not more important than the people that they draw from in order to create it. Now, look at this character. There is absolutely no explanation for this that isn't queer. You've basically got three options, and that's cross-dresser, gender fluid, or non-binary. Each of them is valid, but none of them are entirely within the realm of the typical Westerner's view of the gender binary. Now, a cross-dresser could be completely straight and cis, and no one has to claim a label if they don't fit them. Reminder that I'm talking about real people, not characters that we have to interpret for. However, since cross-dressing is outside of the norm for the gender binary, they are generally welcomed into the LGBTQIA+ community, especially since they tend to be pushed out of cishet spaces. I mean, just look at drag. Drag is basically cross-dressing's older sister, and drag is integral to the queer community now. Being a femboy is also a completely valid option, and there are wonderful cases of that sort of representation in animes like Jellyfish Princess, where we get to witness Kuranosuke Koibuchi both dressed up in full drag and as his male self, showing that he's completely comfortable in both presentations. This is not the case with characters like Bridget, though. She is only ever presented in a feminine light, even when she claims to be pursuing her own masculinity. Or they could also be gender fluid, having run from one of their genders due to the pressures they experienced from the people they were surrounded by. This explanation honestly sounds fairly tempting, as it acknowledges both the genderqueer presentation of their character and the textual storyline that they were giving. And then there's the idea of her being a binary trans woman, which is completely valid, as the text does not get to supersede the community that is represented therein, whether or not that representation was on purpose. No, that's not it! If the story is written from the perspective of a different culture, their rules on gender should apply. Japan's views on where individuals fall within the gender binary is dependent on whether you have masculine or feminine traits, not on the sex characteristics of the individual in question. This point is absolutely all over the discussion around pretty much any genderqueer character in Japanese media, and unfortunately, it's typically done in a way that is disrespectful to both trans people and Japanese culture. The reason being is that the argument usually doesn't come from a place of trying to honor the culture that a piece of media was born of, but rather just as a weapon to justify the continued suppression of trans people. That, by the way, is appropriation. Beyond that, this argument only really works to confirm that Bridget is a woman, and any genderqueer character like her. I'm all for expanding gender roles and fighting against the idea that you have to be masculine to be a man, but the people arguing this are generally against that as well, just not as much as they're against the existence of trans people. We make them uncomfortable, and so they'd rather we just didn't exist at all, let alone in their beloved video games and animes. That being said, there is an opportunity for people to take this stance and do so from a genuine place. So, I'm going to address it as a good faith argument. Japan is transphobic. No, not like the whole country. However, the way the culture tends to view gender is problematic to say the least. I think people tend to glorify Japan's view as gender as a rare marker of empathy towards queer people. Unfortunately, that's not the case. First, I want to point out that same-sex marriage is still not legal in Japan. You can get married in another country where it is legal, and then the Japanese government will recognize your union, but not in the same way as they would a hetero couple. They will essentially recognize you at the same level as a hetero couple that is cohabitating but unmarried. And that only started to happen in 2015. It's similar to an adult going, "Oh yes, you are such a good astronaut doctor dinosaur vet, here's a cookie." It's not real recognition. There's very little respect behind it, and there's a lot of work to be done. And when it comes to gender, they have the same harmful views as traditional Westerners. The only difference is that if you don't measure up to your assigned identity in Japan, you wind up being pushed into the opposite role, whereas here in the West, you wind up being pushed to fulfill the role you were assigned. Both are awful, both force people to be something they're not, and both refuse to recognize people for who they actually are. The argument that this character isn't trans because Japanese culture has a different form of transphobia is not an especially strong stance. At the end of the day, culture is not a valid justification for transphobia. Nothing is. Thousands upon thousands of different cultures have had different rules for different genders, but all of them have had trans people. In some, we were acknowledged. In others, we were repressed. In others still, we were celebrated or even revered. Cultures change. They come and go, but humanity is constant. There is no culture that can permanently deny trans people our humanity. And there is no culture that ever has, nor ever will exist, that can properly justify attempts to strip anyone of their humanity. Wait just a second. It's just a video game character. It's not that deep. Thank you, person who can choose from over half of all existing characters ever to relate to and map yourself onto. You clearly understand what it's like to be starved of representation, and how it feels to finally have a shred of it, only to realize it was written in a way that directly disrespects you. Also, claiming that it's just a character, and therefore not important to classify them as trans is ridiculous, because then it's equally unimportant to prevent that character from being deemed as trans. The why do you care argument is always such an astounding double-edged sword. It's just a word, why are you so offended by it? If it's just a word to you, then why are you so upset at the idea of changing it out for another one? To me, it's an indicator of the baseline of who I am. If it's just a word to you, then it should be easy to use the correct pronouns, right? Anyways, if you haven't come to watch this video from a completely closed off point of view, then I think I've said enough to at least help you understand where I'm coming from, even if you don't agree with me. So, now is the time for the prestige. This video is not about Bridget from Guilty Gear. This video is about Chihiro Fujisaki from Danganronpa. That's right, shit hitters. I was deceiving you this whole time. I'm not arguing about Bridget. That's been confirmed in canon, alright? There are people who are still dumb enough to argue about it online. But this bitch? She needs justice. Some of you have probably already noticed that I wasn't bringing up a lot of specifics about Guilty Gear, and that might have made you suspicious. More of you would have really known that it would be beating a dead horse to make a video entirely about Bridget right now. But maybe surprise? I do apologize for the deception, but it was all to bring us to this one point. Transphobia does not change, it just acquires new targets. Every argument against Bridget being trans that I've shown here can be observed across the internet with a simple search of the words Bridget and trans. This character's gender was so hotly contested that even after her being trans was confirmed in Strive, people still argue against it being true. The 5th Google result for a search of just those 2 words is a video of some transphobe ranting that the developers are lying about Bridget being trans. And the exact same arguments can be seen across the board in discussions surrounding Chihiro's gender as well. And honestly, it's all absurd. Daisuke Ishiwatari, the creator of Guilty Gear, has stated that Bridget was always intended to be trans. Possibly more importantly than that, though, he has also stated that he was not sure if he felt as strongly about it back then as he does now. To me, this strongly indicates that the public reception of Bridget, both by trans people and transphobes, strengthened Ishiwatari's resolve on the matter. Now, I've already discussed authorial intent versus public perception, but I do want to note that Chihiro is clearly not written to be a trans woman in Trigger Happy Havoc. And also to note that that absolutely does not matter. I guarantee you that trans people know more about being trans than Kazutaka Kodaka does. It doesn't matter what he intended the character to be, we can see through that. We recognize the elements of queerness that bleed through the edges of the neat little box that he's tried to put us in. We recognize the bits of ourselves that he's borrowed in order to turn our identity into a cheap little party trick. I've also seen plenty of arguments falling back on the fact that you can dress feminine without identifying as a woman, and that arguing for Chihiro being trans can overwrite cross-dressing representation. On its own, this argument is entirely valid, but there's a major flaw in that argument when it comes to Danganronpa. There is absolutely no way that this game respects cross-dressers either. Not only is it loaded to the brim with homophobic sentiment and sexist writing, but Chihiro's presentation is simply written to be a tool for defense, not anything that she actually did for herself. Another argument that would be reasonable for a piece of media that shows itself to respect queerness and gender is that the theme of Chihiro's case is about overcoming traditional views of masculinity and accepting yourself. If anything, Kazutaka Kodaka's writing imitates this message as a sort of smokescreen for his own blatant transphobia. The justification for Chihiro being a supposed cis male and dressing as a girl is that she was bullied for being weak and decided to hide from that by presenting as a weak girl. Sexism aside, when Chihiro supposedly decides to accept herself, that method is by trying to become something she's not. Her entire stated goal is to become strong enough to not be bullied for being weak. Not to accept herself as she is, where she's at, not to overcome her bullies through self-love, but to succumb to their expectations and to do her best to fulfill the masculine role she was assigned at birth. That doesn't sound very inspiring to me, but you do you, I guess. What that does sound like to me, however, is an extinction burst. In behavioral therapy, a practice with a long history of both controversy and benefits, a final increase of a non-reinforced behavior is typically observed before that behavior fizzles out. This is usually a way of seeking out the reward that that behavior used to receive, and can be observed quite commonly in trans people. Basically, when we're questioning our gender, we tend to lean really hard into our assigned roles before finally accepting who we are. In trans men, this can look like getting really into feminine attire or making sure your makeup is done every day and you have your nails done every other week. It can also look like getting into hobbies that are deemed feminine, like horse jockeying or crocheting or knitting. In trans women, this often shows up as growing out your facial hair, or joining the military, or focusing on the gym. This overcompensation is usually a last-ditch effort to really feel like your gender, before realizing that that isn't who you are at all. If you're becoming uncertain of your assigned gender, you'll likely subconsciously try and seek out the comfort of being connected to it. This sort of behavior fits Chihiro to a T. She's faced with the uncomfortable position of being outed, and rather than accepting her gender as it is, she tries to do a final hard pivot into masculinity, attempting to get strong enough to not be bullied for being a weak man. If Chihiro were a real person capable of exploring her own gender, there's a high chance that she'd wind up identifying as a woman within a year. Unfortunately, she's just a video game character written by a person with harmful views on gender. But in spite of Kazutaka Kodaka's intent to just use this as a fun little mystery twist, there's actually a few in-universe textual bits that lend a lot of credibility to Chihiro actually being a trans woman. Firstly, she's a programmer. Anyone in the trans community knows that a surprising amount of programmers are trans, especially trans women. There's some speculation as to why, or if that's even actually the case and not just an availability bias, but having grown up in a period where computers in general were considered a masculine pursuit, alongside not really fitting in with our expected in-groups, sounds reasonable to me. If you're destined to become a shut-in with need for escape and something to find value in yourself for once, and you happen to have a computer on hand, then those dots are probably going to connect themselves. That, or you'll write the Matrix movies. I'm gonna get into some mid-level spoilers for the first two Danganronpa games here, so if you do want to experience those for your own, this might be the station to step off at. Do be warned though, on top of the fun mysteries and interesting lore, there is a thick, grimy layer of pervy fan service, sexist writing, transphobic, homophobic, and fatphobic remarks, and callous edgelord level treatment of topics involving death. It's a lot to get through, but I do think the series is fun overall. If you're uncertain, feel free to stick around, because the spoilers, while being decently big, shouldn't be enough to ruin the experience. The second bit of damning evidence is Chihiro's AI duplicate, Alter Ego. This one. Imagine making something that represents yourself to a T, a replica that's as exact as you can possibly get it. Would that replica also have the same gender as you? Because if not, I think you have some questions you should ask yourself. Alter Ego's gender is only specified in the second Danganronpa game, Goodbye Despair, where Hajime refers to her as a she. Meanwhile, behind her, the profile text meant to look like code simply states, not female. She, but not female. Also important to note, when she first introduces herself in Trigger Happy Havoc, she introduces herself as Chihiro Fujisaki, not as Alter Ego. That is the name of the program. Later, she does begin to ask people to refer to her as Alter Ego, viewing that as the name that the original Chihiro gave her. So, Chihiro made an AI double, made it look and talk exactly like her, and made it a woman who is not female. Yeah, very cis. No questions here. Alter Ego is also referred to as the Ultimate Programmer, the title that Chihiro used to hold. Alter Ego can imitate anyone she comes across pretty much exactly, but her default form is always Chihiro. This essentially confirms that Alter Ego really is just Chihiro in a machine. So, if Alter Ego is a girl, so is Chihiro. Even when trying to make Chihiro cis, they just can't seem to manage it. And that's what happens when you try to write about a minority group that you don't understand. There's still one more thing to discuss though. Even if Chihiro was a completely cisgender crossdresser with no interest in identifying as a woman, Danganronpa is still an incredibly transphobic game. Upon discovering that she has a different set of genitalia than expected, her entire group of supposed friends begin to refer to her as a man immediately. They also have very strong reactions to this news, acting betrayed by Chihiro's supposed deception. These characters have no indication that Chihiro might identify differently than she's been presenting this entire time. Mondo has not come forward about the private conversation that they had before. Not to mention that the entire cast then proceeds to say things that are not only transphobic towards Chihiro, but to trans people in general, wrongfully implying that genitals completely determine your gender. It's honestly exhausting having to battle for scraps of representation, and I really wish we had the respect required to have widespread good representation already. If that were the case, we wouldn't even bother arguing for Chihiro being trans. we would recognize her as a poorly written transphobic remark and move on with our lives. I do plan on making a video about trans representation in general, but for now, thank goodness we have Bridget. But that's really the problem here. Even if Chihiro really was a cis male character that only happened to appear to be a trans woman, then trans representation would still be far more important than any cis representation. Look, a lot of the arguments I've presented in this video come from the assumption that you, the viewer, do not want to be a transphobe, and I really hope that's the case. Unfortunately, I know all too well that the actual points I'm fighting against are usually not made by people who feel that way. They're typically made by people who are very open about not wanting trans people to exist, or at the very least hold that sentiment a little more privately and would rather just pretend to argue from the stance of canonical purity in order to avoid the condemnation that can come from being openly transphobic. But I've seen these arguments bleed into otherwise well-meaning folks as well, and so I'm hoping that if you are one of those, that I might have made you a little more aware and given you the opportunity to avoid accidentally intaking transphobic arguments. Look, we're desperate for representation. Anyone who's part of a minority group knows exactly what that feels like. Anyone who isn't doesn't have a clue. Before I realized I was trans, I had no idea what that was like. I thought I was a cis white male and I saw myself everywhere. Now that I know I'm a transgender lesbian, I can't find myself anywhere. It's hard feeling alone. Even knowing how many transgender friends I have and the thousands upon thousands of trans people on the internet that I've seen and interacted with, there's still this world where we're practically non-existent. I can't look through the news without seeing people use my identity as a political talking point. But when I watch movies, there's no one like me. My Instagram feed is filled with other trans people who understand what it's like to be me. But when I watch TV shows, there's no one. Right now, it's far more acceptable to voice a negative opinion about trans people than it is to simply be trans in most public spaces. If you care about trans people, but feel a discomfort when seeing us claim characters that otherwise aren't stated to be trans, or a sense of upset at characters previously assumed to be cis being confirmed as trans, then I'd kindly ask you to consider, what do you actually lose when we gain representation? What is it that you lack when we have? For a long time, I thought it was wrong to change a character for the sake of others. But isn't it much worse to keep them from others? I hope I've provided some good food for thought. At the very least, I hope that you'll begin to consider representation in a meta way, rather than exclusively basing your views on the information provided within the text of a piece. It's a surprisingly important distinction, and I hope you won't miss out on a wider view of things going forward. For now, though, I'll see you in the next video. Whenever that actually is. I can't seem to make these on a regular schedule, so please don't hold your breath. My conscience couldn't bear the weight of a death based on my procrastination. At least it'd be pretty hard for them to figure out I'm the black info. Anyways, love you, bye.